Alors, bienvenue tout le monde à notre table ronde pour aujourd'hui. Le thème est en haut. Ici, être professeur dans une université bilingue. Enjeux, défis relatifs au développement et au maintien des compétences en langue seconde. So, being a professor in a bilingual university, it's probably not as obvious as we think it is. I have one little bit of one announcement to make. When you're using the headphones, you have to leave them in the room when you leave because they need to charge. So someone has gone off with theirs. I think they've decided it's permanent jewelry or something, but it's not. So we ask you to please leave them on the charging station when you leave. And the other is if you're using it, there's a little kind of a rolling button if you want to adjust the volume if you're not having difficulty. Thank you, Marie-Josée. Yeah, and you wear it down in front, not over your head. It's not a bow, it's a necklace. There we go. Okay. All right, so I have the pleasure of working with Madame Huguette Bourgeois. She is the person responsible for all of the language training for our professors here at the University of Ottawa. I'm going to just give you quickly a brief overview how this is going to work. It's split into 3 steps. I'm going to let Huguette talk to you first to give you that overview I just mentioned. And then after that, part 2 of part 1, how's that? Each of the speakers will get a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, what department they're from, the language training that they've had. They've all gone through the language school here with us at the University of Ottawa. And then round 2 has an opportunity for them to address specific questions that I have put to them. So they will each have an opportunity to address each of those issues. We'll have about 5 minutes for questions. And then there are very specific questions that they will address based on the language reality in their individual departments. And then there'll be opportunity for questions at the end. So I've got it timed, so we'll try and keep it as tight as possible, right? So I will hand la parole maintenant à Huguette. Voilà.
Merci Sheila. Oui, ça a été tout un périple, cette histoire. On a commencé en 2006. À offrir des cours. Au début, c'était seulement des cours de groupe. Très vite, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait énormément d'autres besoins, comme il y a des profs qu'il fallait qu'ils enseignent dans leur langue seconde, donc il fallait à ce moment-là aller vers les tutorats. Et il y en a d'autres qui ne pouvaient pas apprendre en groupe, et il y en avait d'autres qui avaient des problèmes avec ci, avec ça, d'horaire et tout. Donc les tutorats sont devenus très importants. Ensuite, pour ceux qui enseignaient, a fallu s'assurer que tous les documents de salle de classe soient corrigés et tout, donc encore un autre service. Donc les services se sont accumulés comme ça au fur et à mesure. Et puis aujourd'hui, on a toute une panoplie de services. Si jamais ça vous intéresse, j'ai de l'information ici, vous pouvez en prendre. Donc il y a eu énormément de défis pendant ces années, mais quand même beaucoup de succès. On a vu beaucoup de professeurs, puisque je vais juste vous expliquer un tout petit peu pour ceux qui ne connaissaient pas. Il faut qu'ils aient un certain niveau de bilinguisme pour obtenir la permanence. Donc, il y a le niveau de bilinguisme passif et le niveau de bilinguisme actif. Donc, ces 2 niveaux doivent être atteints, dépendant des besoins des départements ou des facultés. Donc, il faut avoir différents niveaux de formation à ce moment-là. Et en fin de compte, je ne vais pas vous raconter tout ça, mais ce qui s'est passé avec le temps, c'est que les besoins ont changé. Et ce qui se passe maintenant, c'est qu'on a de plus en plus besoin un grand besoin pour, je pense, faire de la recherche sur ce phénomène d'un campus bilingue et d'un corps professoral bilingue. C'est quelque chose de très, très unique et en même temps, qui n'est pas si unique que ça si on voit sur la scène internationale avec la montée de l'anglais. On voit plusieurs universités en Europe où c'est pas uniquement le français et l'anglais, mais l'allemand et l'anglais, l'espagnol et l'anglais, l'italien et l'anglais. Donc tout le monde a un peu ce défi. Et puis pour nous, ici aussi, il y a autre chose qui est absolument nécessaire, c'est d'offrir aux profs la possibilité surtout pour les professeurs francophones, la possibilité de pouvoir publier en anglais. Donc, j'ai aussi offert pour la première fois un cours qui s'appelle academic writing for publication, donc ça devient de plus en plus populaire, et donc voilà, c'est là où on en est. Alors voilà, je vous ai fait un petit aperçu de ce qui se passe, et puis maintenant je vous retourne à Sheila.
Merci, Huguette. So, à ce moment-ci, ce qu'on va faire, je vais introduire chacun de nos participants, nos profs, et puis je vais leur demander de simplement parler un peu de leur travail, leurs responsabilités administratives, le niveau de bilinguisme qu'ils ont dû atteindre, un niveau actif ou passif, et puis le genre de formation qu'ils ont reçu. Alors, premièrement, I have the Associate Professor Jaya Peruvemba from the Department of Communication. So, Jaya, please.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, my name is Peruvemba Jaya. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication within the Faculty of Arts. And when I first came to Ottawa U in 2006, one of the reasons that attracted me here was the fact that it is Ottawa, because I came from Newfoundland, Memorial University. But the other thing that was interesting about the position was that I was offered a position with the level of bilingualism expectation being passive bilingualism. In other words, what that means is you are expected to understand and sort of figure out what's going on in the second language. Obviously, as you probably have guessed, my second language in this context would be French. And so that was the expectation, but that means you are never expected to be teaching in French or doing any other kind of writing or publishing in French. So that was sort of the expectation. My work involves both teaching, research, and service, like any other faculty position here. And through the years, one of the things that I found very interesting here is that the training that I received through ELOB, through the Institute, really helped me and supported me to reach the point where I am now, where I can say that I'm passively bilingual. And it is an expectation for tenure too, so it was extremely important to get through that process. So in terms of my work, I have to say that in reality, because of the fact that it's the Department of Communication, a lot of the meetings I held, there is no like 50-50 representation. A lot of the meetings are probably held more in French than in English. So I will speak more about that later. But therefore, through that process of just interacting, talking to colleagues, participating, I think automatically that's sort of the training ground, which makes it seem like even though you're passive, you come to a level which may be somewhere between passive and active to be able to function. And so in that respect, a couple of things. I had no knowledge and no training at all of French before I came here, ground zero, basically starting from scratch. And so obviously it was a big concern in terms of going through the process when you're going through tenure and doing all the other things that you're supposed to do to be able to be actively functioning in this environment. But a number of the administrative responsibilities that I took on, being part of committees, for instance, were all, many of them were key and important committees. For example, the Teaching and Personnel Committee, the Graduate Studies Committee, recently a committee that was created to put forth a proposal for a new PhD program in our department. All of them required a level of engagement and participation which tested, I would say, or challenged one to be able to understand enough of the second language, in this context being French, so that you were able to, you had to function more than was, to be able to function effectively, because obviously there's no translation in meetings, and there's an expectation that you're going to be able to understand what's going on. So even though I got trained through the Institute, and I got through the process and made it for tenure, I found that the training was ongoing after that, which actually made it better, because you are always challenged to listen, to really pay attention to what is being said in the language that is not of your first language. In my case, of course, I come from a multilingual country, so it's probably my third or fourth or fifth language. So the challenges become even more. But I think that's the beauty of being here on this campus. I find that actually an opportunity, as well as a challenge, but also an opportunity that you can make a lot out of because of that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
We'll leave it at that because you've got lots more to tell us next round. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Julian Little. He's the chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Community Medicine. And Dr. Little had to achieve an active level of French proficiency here at the University of Ottawa. So I will...
Alors, je suis né à Belfast, en Irlande du Nord. Là, on parle Ulster. Mais en fait, j'ai eu une petite formation en français là-bas, à le haut level, donc entre l'âge de 11 ans et 15 ans. Après, j'ai passé 1 an à Bruxelles, et puis, il y a presque 20 ans, j'ai passé 5 ans à Lyon, au Centre international de recherche sur le cancer. Donc, j'ai eu des expositions à français européen avant de venir ici à Ottawa. Et en fait, c'était une des attractions de venir à Ottawa, la proximité des deux cultures. Donc, je suis arrivé à la faculté de médecine. L'expectation est un bilinguisme passif, même si au niveau de formation de premier cycle en médecine, il y a une rivière en anglais et il y a un chemin en français. Donc, il y a les deux. Et pour nous, pour notre département, la plupart de l'éducation de formation est en anglais. La plupart des étudiants sont anglophones. Même si on a des étudiants francophones, leur préférence est de se mettre leur travail en anglais parce qu'ils veulent avoir l'expérience de défendre leur travail en anglais parce que c'est effectivement, pour l'instant, la langue la plus courante dans ce domaine de recherche. However, there are other occasions when it is helpful to go beyond passive bilingualism. So as department chair, which I became 8 years ago, I was concerned that I'd be going to meetings downtown, and like Jaya, we had the issue of taking a new PhD program in epidemiology through committees. And so I said that I would like to be more trained in French as it's spoken in Canada, at which point I went to some of the sessions that Huguette had, and she assessed my level as kind of intermediate and suggested that an experience in Jonquière might be very helpful. And I went to Jonquière for 2 weeks, I think in 2006, which was a very nice experience. I had one-to-one tuition. It was complete immersion in French. I stayed with a French family. It was very comfortable speaking French with them. There was a lot of attempt rééducation de mon petit accent. It wasn't very effective. You need un baco qui passe là-bas beaucoup de temps pour une rééducation de Ulster. Mais bon, it was a very nice experience, and I came back with, I mean, some awareness of deficiencies, the frustration in my faculty, and I speak not only for myself, but for people in my department who've undergone various forms of French training, is people really enjoy it, but in day-to-day use, we have very little occasion to use it in the Faculty of Medicine. Now, that may change as we get, we're planning to have an MPH, a Master of Public Health degree. The expectation there is that there would be some Francophone education in there. So that's an aspect that we intend to develop. And we have 2 Francophone members of the department, which is a start. But the trouble is people get educated and then they don't have the opportunity to use it. And that's one of the frustrations here. The other point I would say, and I've talked with Sheila about this, is that France, as it's spoken in Lutuwe, is like nothing on earth. It's very different from European French, and to my ears, which my wife, who's a languages graduate, by the way, tells me my ears are hopeless. But to my ears, I find French as it's spoken in Quebec City, in the Saguenay, in Lac-Saint-Jean, and in Montreal, much easier to follow than French spoken in Ottawa or on the other side of the river. So one of the feelings I have, and Sheila and I talked about, is that actually for those of us who are Anglophone working in the Outaouais, that something like Français d'ici might be very, very helpful.
I recommended your course. Marie-Claude, j'ai suggéré ton cours. Thank you, Julian. Alors, la dernière personne que vous allez rencontrer aujourd'hui, c'est le professeur Maurice Lévesque. Il est le directeur du département de sociologie et d'anthropologie. Alors, je vous cède la parole.
Merci. Je suis à l'Université d'Ottawa depuis 2003, donc un peu plus d'une dizaine d'années maintenant. Mes premiers contacts avec la langue anglaise ont été à l'époque où j'étais à l'école secondaire, où nos professeurs étaient des personnes qui étaient unilingues francophones. Donc, ça n'a pas été nécessairement l'expérience la plus formatrice dès le départ. J'ai fait l'ensemble de ma formation universitaire dans les universités francophones au Québec. Et donc, lorsque je suis arrivé en 2003 à l'Université d'Ottawa, j'étais très fonctionnel sous le plan de la lecture, de la littérature en langue anglaise, particulièrement évidemment dans ma discipline. En ce qui concerne la capacité de s'exprimer ou de comprendre, j'étais au même niveau qu'à l'école secondaire, c'est-à-dire proche de zéro. J'ai commencé par la suite à utiliser les services de l'université. On m'a offert des cours, on m'a offert une immersion de 2 ou 3 semaines au Nouveau-Brunswick. On m'a offert aussi, très généreusement, une série de tutorats qui ont été, à mon avis, peut-être qu'il aurait pu être un peu plus efficace si moi-même j'avais investi davantage, mais la qualité même du soutien de l'ILOB et de l'université sont vraiment, à mon avis, de très, très haut niveau. En sociologie, on peut travailler presque essentiellement en français si on le désire. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a une longue et grande tradition française, francophone, en sociologie. Ici, à l'Université d'Ottawa, on travaille à la fois dans les traditions francophones et dans les traditions anglophones, soit américaines, soit britanniques, soit des autres pays où on publie davantage en anglais. Mais il est possible ici de faire une carrière, si on veut, qui serait uniquement basée sur le français. Ce qui, quand même, constitue une limite, parce que même si la langue française est encore extrêmement vivante en sociologie, la langue anglaise, comme dans d'autres disciplines, devient de plus en plus prégnante et importante. À la Faculté des sciences sociales, l'ensemble des profs doivent atteindre des niveaux de bilinguisme actif. Et donc, avec l'aide du soutien reçu ici, j'ai pu atteindre ce niveau de bilinguisme actif. Malheureusement, que j'ai un petit peu perdu avec le temps pour des raisons particulières associées au contexte particulier de la Faculté des sciences sociales et de mon département. Je dirai quelques mots plus tard sur cette situation-là qui est un peu particulière à l'intérieur de l'université. Donc, à partir d'une formation, d'une compétence très, très limitée en anglais au début, je suis quand même arrivé à rencontrer les objectifs ou les critères de bilinguisme actif en anglais depuis mon arrivée ici.
OK. Merci beaucoup. It's always tricky, right? On cède la parole à des professeurs, puis on veut vraiment qu'ils s'en tiennent à 2 et 3 minutes chaque. Mais là, déjà, on a commencé, chacun et chacune ont déjà dépassé ça, mais ils ont déjà commencé à répondre aux questions de la deuxième étape. Alors, on est rendu à moitié chemin. Alors, comme deuxième étape, cette fois-ci, je leur ai demandé de préparer une courte présentation de la réalité dans vos départements différents, dans vos départements distincts, et de parler des points suivants. So, opportunities that you have to use your second language, the real level of bilingualism in your in your respective departments, and professional advantages to being bilingual. So I've told them they have 5 minutes. Let's see how we do. Okay. Jaya, do you want to start?
In terms of opportunity, I kind of spoke about it. I think I what did I do? I skipped and did it earlier, but I'll just repeat myself. There are lots of opportunities to use the second language, even if you are not considered actively bilingual. In other words, especially in meetings, committee meetings, departmental meetings, other kinds of interactions, people move fluently, especially those who are actively bilingual and fluent in both French and English in this context. They move fluently between both languages, and you are expected to keep up because you are in this bilingual environment. So in that sense, there is a lot of opportunity to use the second language. Now, I think it's pretty much up to oneself how much you would like to do that. In other words, in my case, I found just coming to Ottawa U and reaching the point where I was passively bilingual and trying to make it for tenure and do all the other things that one is supposed to was quite a jump. And so moving beyond that and trying to say, okay, let me maintain the passive bilingualism, but also let me try to get maybe better at the second language and try to be, if not actively bilingual, at least functionally bilingual, if I can put it like that, in this kind of environment. I think that's the biggest challenge, and it's an ongoing process. I found that participating, and which is why I kind of put myself, it's almost like a self-test. I decided that I would, early on, that I would participate in committees that require a high level of engagement. And so do that as a sort of challenge to myself, because I would have to understand what was going on without asking for translation. Now, the reality, though, is that in our department, even though, I mean, technically we are a bilingual university, in our department, I have to say most of the transactions and interactions are conducted in French more than English. So almost 95, like I said, almost 99%. So that's a real pressure, because you have to always understand what is going on every time. But the colleagues are very kind. So if you tell them, for instance, at times I've told them, you know, you're speaking too fast for me to figure out what's going on. I mean, probably it's okay for you guys, but for me, it's too much of a stress and pressure. Then people slow down and they cooperate. So there are many ways by which you kind of negotiate and navigate this sort of system of active bilingualism. And I mean, the actual functional bilingualism is of an active nature. So that's the way I've negotiated that. So I would say the real level of bilingualism expectation is almost to the level of active, because of the way that our department functions, where there is more French spoken than English. If you were to look at every meeting, there's literally more French than English. And part of it is because of the composition of the department, I feel. It looks like there are more Francophones who are actively engaged in different departmental levels in terms of meetings and so on. Recently, we actually went through a process to create a new PhD program, which will take off next year. And one of the criteria that is being adopted to recruit students there is that students are expected to be actively bilingual, which I think is pretty unique and different. Maybe it's there in other departments too, but that was something that created a lot of debate between between colleagues within the department, and that's another challenge that we all have to face going ahead to the future in terms of supervision, courses, teaching, and so on. So even though some of the professors are not actively bilingual, the expectation of incoming students into the PhD program is that they will be actively bilingual, meaning they will have to have proficiency in both English and French, which is, we'll see how that goes. So I just thought I'd mention that. What are the advantages of being bilingual? Again, I have to say that I find this term bilingual has to be defined. I'm sure we all know what it is. But for me, coming from a multilingual context, coming from India, it always seemed very strange to be called, what are we talking about when we say bilingual? But here, of course, bilingualism means English-French. Now, the reality is, when I started learning French, it was probably my fourth, fifth, I don't know. I know a number of different languages at different levels within India. But one of the things that I found easy in terms of learning French was the fact that I found it a relief that I didn't have to learn a whole new script, because you're using the same writing process as in English. Whereas in a number of other languages, you learn a whole new script each time. So that was sort of the easier part. The advantages in this context are that it gives me access to a number of different things, and it opened my mind to a whole other world before I came, like which I was not privy to before I came here. It helps me in interactions with my Francophone colleagues, as well as my Anglophone colleagues, of course, but English was not an issue before I came here. And so it made me, I felt, probably a little more, open-minded, because I had to open my mind to this reality and function effectively here, because that is the reality of this university, and more so the reality of my department. So I find it's more an advantage, because I felt that, okay, I'm learning a new language. Maybe I'm not learning it as well as, I'm not really like top of the line in terms of competency, but at least I've learned French, and I can understand almost everything that's said. I may not be able to respond in the same language, but I can figure out, and I've survived. So that's the advantage, I think, of being bilingual.
All right.
Especially in the Canadian context, because in Canada, we are in a place where we have 2 official languages. So it's certainly an asset knowing the other language. And plus, it's being, the training was something that was being supported by the university through ELOB. Madame Bourgeois was extremely kind and helpful through the process. And so the whole thing was set up for you, so what could be better than that? You are learning another language, and you're learning it, and you don't get, you don't have to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And you're learning it, and you're learning a new language, and you're trying to function in this kind of, it's not just a language, it's also a new cultural environment, as that's what I'd like to say. And,
Okay.
and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jaya. Dr. Little?
I think I stepped into this role in some of my first comments, but again, just to repeat myself, the expectation in the Faculty of Medicine is passive bilingualism. The faculty is very research intensive, so thinking through Destination 2020. It emphasizes research intensiveness, it intensifies quality of the student experience. It also emphasizes internationalism. So it has formal links with Université de Paris 5, it has formal links with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and it has particularly formal links with Jiaotong University near to Shanghai in southern China. Jiaotong University is an interesting one because it started as a Jesuit college in the part of Shanghai that was under French administration in the 1920s. So it was a bilingual college in French and Mandarin. It survived the communists coming into power. In fact, the Communist Party established its headquarters in the top of their building. That enabled it to survive the Cultural Revolution. And so this small college was able to provide medical care to the Communist Party and offer medical education. And it was actually looking for partnership, and it was interested in Ottawa because it's a bilingual university in English and French. So it was the French connection. So what is actually happening through that link is a joint new medical school is being set up in which professors from the University of Ottawa will actually provide Anglophone education to people, students coming through that. My colleagues who've been over there tell me that the level of English as well as the French is extraordinarily good. I mean, from our point of view, that's very exciting. But I think it comes back to some of the points Jay was making about what our understanding of bilingualism and multilingualism is. So that was one point I wanted to make. The second one, coming back to what Jay, actually a similar experience with Jay with establishing a PhD program. We had been invested in the PhD program in population health, which was set up actively as a bilingual PhD program. There were 2 frustrations with that program that actually led to the impetus to create a PhD program in epidemiology. One was that the more clinical end of epidemiological and population-based research tended to be excluded. So that was one reason to establish a new PhD program. and with that tend to go the more quantitative aspects. The other was actually on the internationalism aspect. There were students coming from overseas. We get quite a few from Central and South America. We get some from Africa. We get some from different parts of Asia. They're really bilingual, but it tends to be their own mother tongue plus English more than French. And to expect them to come to Ottawa and master a third language on top of a new environment really seems quite tough. So that was why we debated actually whether we would make the PhD in epidemiology bilingual, as was the PhD in population health, and we decided no. And that's why. So it was part of the internationalism. So one of the things, and I may be getting into the last part, but one of the things that comes to my mind is any second language tends to make it easier to learn a third. So, I mean, I have learned some Italian, which I also speak with an Ulster accent and grammar. Bon. La vie est belle.
La vie est belle.
But I mean, it tends to come and it opens up culturally. So one of the thoughts that has particularly occurred to me as a result of the partnerships in the Faculty of Medicine is actually whether we can use the edge we've been doing in bilingual education more broadly to give people the tools to acquire other languages that they might use in their research collaborations.
Okay. Merci. Et puis le docteur Lévesque.
Pour décrire un peu la situation dans notre département, je vais commencer par parler de nos programmes. Nous avons actuellement 2 programmes de maîtrise, un programme de doctorat. En principe, tous les étudiants qui sont inscrits à ces programmes doivent être bilingues actifs. C'est-à-dire que toutes les personnes inscrites doivent suivre au moins 1 ou 2 cours en langue française. Ce qui soulève un certain nombre de défis. C'est-à-dire que c'est facile de recruter des étudiants franco-ontariens, par exemple, qui parlent l'anglais. C'est un peu plus difficile de recruter des étudiants anglophones qui parlent le français. Donc, c'est un défi de recrutement. Par contre, c'est une tradition assez ancienne dans mon département que de faire la promotion de l'usage du français, de telle sorte que nos programmes aux études supérieures prévoient cette condition. Dans notre département, nous sommes un département qui est l'endroit idéal pour l'immersion des personnes anglophones. Notre langue publique et la langue administrative, c'est le français. C'est-à-dire que tout se passe sur le plan formel en langue française dans le département. Les rencontres du Conseil, de l'Assemblée, les rencontres des comités se déroulent toujours en langue française. Évidemment, les anglophones ou les personnes qui ont d'autres langues peuvent utiliser la langue qu'ils désirent, mais dans un contexte formel, on utilise toujours la langue française. La raison pour laquelle ça se passe comme ça, c'est des raisons historiques qui sont liées à la volonté assez importante du département de maintenir ou de faire la promotion de la langue française. De telle sorte que pour les anglophones qui arrivent dans notre département, ils deviennent bilingues très, très rapidement. À l'opposé, pour les francophones qui ont de la difficulté avec l'anglais, ce n'est pas un milieu très propice pour développer leurs compétences ou leur expertise en langue anglaise. Actuellement, sur le plan de nos programmes, on prévoit éventuellement faire une plus large place à des programmes qui auraient des demandes, des exigences moins élevées sur le plan linguistique, notamment parce que ces conditions renvoient à des difficultés importantes de recrutement pour les étudiants. Comme directeur, on ne me sollicite presque jamais pour utiliser la langue anglaise. Tous les collègues peuvent parler en langue française et comme la langue public, le français. C'est très, très rare qu'on va s'adresser au directeur en utilisant la langue anglaise. De telle sorte que mes fonctions de directeur de département ne m'ont pas amené véritablement à plus utiliser la langue anglaise qu'auparavant lorsque je n'avais pas ce type de fonction. Le tiers environ de mes collègues enseignent à la fois en langue française et en langue anglaise. Certains sont francophones d'origine, d'autres sont anglophones d'origine, d'autres ont d'autres langues maternelles. Donc, on a des personnes dans les deux langues qui enseignent également dans les deux langues. La situation linguistique, si on veut, dans le département en est une très consensuelle. Il n'y a pas de difficulté ou de conflit dans la répartition des tâches selon la question de la langue. Donc, on est dans un contexte où le français est très, très valorisé. Et donc, cette grande importance du français est un atout vraiment très important pour les personnes de langue anglaise, mais en contrepartie, pour les personnes de langue française, ce n'est pas le lieu le plus favorable pour un meilleur apprentissage de la langue anglaise.
C'est beau. Merci beaucoup. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so unless someone had a pressing question at this point, maybe what I'll do is I'll just roll into the last part, because then they're going to have individual opinions about specific questions that I'd ask them to address, and then there might be better, you might have other types of questions to ask at that point. So unless someone has a pressing question that they urgently need to ask at this point, I think we'll just roll right into phase 3. We're all right? Okay. So as I said, I met with each of them individually, and I don't think an hour and a half was at least the minimum amount of time I spent with anybody. It was extremely interesting and very, they had very diverse entry points to the language and what goes on in their departments. And so based on their individual situations, I had asked them to think about very specific points. And in, I've been calling her Jaya, everybody else is calling her Jaya, so I think I better go that way. So what I had said, what I'd asked Jaya to look at for me was challenges of having a passive level of bilingualism in a bilingual department, and the realities of having to learn a third or fourth language in order to get tenure. Now, she's alluded to some of these, but I know when she was talking to me, there were times where she was saying, you know, it can be a little dicey when you kind of ask people, yeah, can you repeat, can you slow down? So I just would like her to maybe expand a little bit on the realities of being and the challenges of having a passive level of bilingualism in such a bilingual department.
Yeah, actually the main challenge, as I explained earlier, is in our department the reality is that there's more French used than English. And so that was something that was, I had to deal with that because that's the reality. So keeping up with what's going on was the biggest challenge, and was also the biggest learning tool for me to try to improve, you know, my level of French. So even though now I'm still not confident or comfortable speaking in French, I think I'm in some place where I can kind of understand most of what's going on. And yet sometimes what happens is it goes on for long periods of time. So it's, you know, with the second language ability being less than the so-called first language, you do have, you know, you do have a point where you sometimes you're tired, right? It's the end of the day, it's the afternoon, or so you can always ask. Like I said, the way I dealt with it was I would ask people to repeat themselves or slow down, which is okay in smaller committee meetings, which is not always possible in larger department level meetings because there's lots of talking going on. So that was an issue. But more than that, I think what happens is that, and this is something that goes across languages. It could be any language which is a language that is not your first language. So neither English or French are my first language, really. So in that sense, and it's also a different cultural context. English as it's spoken in India has a whole other flavor as compared to English spoken in the United States or Canada or UK or whatever, right? So there is that cultural context as well, and that I thought was the biggest challenge. For example, even though I would understand probably most of what was going on and get the gist of, the essence of what's happening, often there are, little jokes, culturally contextualized references, maybe to places, maybe to events, even in terms of recent history or long-term history, or events in terms of the life of the department between old-timers who've been there a long time, and they're all looking at each other and, laughing away, and they've cracked a joke, and sometimes it's like, I don't know what they're talking about. And that's something you can't really ask them to repeat because you don't know the context. So even if they did say it, speak slower, you probably wouldn't get the whole meaning. And I think that goes beyond language, right? Because it's a lot to do with socialization in a cultural context. So for me, it's always like, okay, what are they saying and what does it mean? And sometimes they try to explain very kindly, very patiently. But often it's those kinds of cues you miss. I think the cultural cues, which are sort of embedded in a lot of the, not just the language, but the gesturing and everything else that goes along, the nonverbal cues, so that is, I would say, the biggest sort of, the blind spot, which I'm still working on in terms of, trying to figure that out. And I don't know if I'll ever get it right, so that's always a learning point. The other piece is that, and in terms of learning a new language, in my case, it's, I don't know, third, fourth, fifth, probably language to get tenure, is that you're trying to do so many different things. You've got in here, you're starting from the, you have to hit the ground running, and you know that you want to get tenure in whatever number of years. In my case, I came already with a fair amount of experience from 1 year at a university in the United States and a few years out east in Memorial University. So it was a big step leaving all that and coming here and then saying, okay, you have to also learn French on top of publishing, teaching, conferences, all kinds of stuff, administrative activities, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the hardest thing was, because all the other languages that I'd learned before had been when I was very young as a child, I kind of took it for granted. It had been a really long time since I'd learned any other language, a new language. So I thought, okay, I know all these other languages. I guess I was a little arrogant at that time and naive. And I thought, okay, it's not going to be a big deal. It will be challenging, but I'll manage. But trust me, it wasn't. It wasn't easy at all. It required a lot of effort. I had to really come to grips with it in my head and say, well, look at this. I am an adult learner now. I'm no longer a kid, and it's going to be very hard, and I have a lot of other things to do. And that's something that I think also was explained very well to me by Madame Bourgeois in various conversations. Because I think in the beginning it was extremely frustrating because I wanted to just, I wanted to get really out there really fast. It wasn't happening. And there were times when in the French classes it was like, what is going on? I have no idea what talking about the teacher. So little by little, step by step, it happened. Of course, I'm not saying I'm completely competent or proficient, but that was something that I didn't really think enough about, the fact that I'm learning a language at a much later stage in life compared to all the other languages that I knew. And being an adult learner is a whole other cup of tea, right? Because it's a whole other ball game. It's a whole other set of issues. So that was, I think, the biggest, sort of learning point for me, that you have to know what it is like to be learning something new, a new language at a different stage of life than you would ordinarily expect to be learning something new. And it opened my mind, because now I feel, okay, if I did this, probably I can learn something else. Maybe another language or another skill or whatever. It really helped me come to terms with my own learning, shortcomings, if you will, as well as the strengths I might have had, and sort of use them both to come to a point where I can, say, well, I did use that. But that's sort of the biggest lesson, I would say. The challenge was being an adult learner in an environment where you're doing all these other things as well, and having to function at sort of in a very good way, because you have to make tenure. So it's all this other stuff that you would do at any other place, on top of that, you have a new language to learn. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'm watching the clock very carefully because I have my own presentation that's coming up at 2:30. So I anyway, very selfishly. Professor Little, moi, je vous avais donné 3 questions. Les avantages que vous avez remarqués comme chercheur bilingue, je pense que vous avez déjà commencé à parler de ce thème-là. L'autre aussi, je crois, quelles portes ou possibilités de recherche nouveaux collègues ont été offertes puisque vous êtes bilingue. Et je pense aussi que vous en avez fait allusion un peu, mais peut-être vous pouvez nous en parler davantage. Et les avantages de pouvoir travailler des deux côtés de l'océan Atlantique aussi. Okay.
Par rapport avec l'ouverture des portes, mon expérience dès mon arrivée au Canada, c'est de travailler un peu avec des chercheurs au Québec. Et là, j'ai trouvé au début qu'ils ont parlé avec moi en anglais, comme un signe de respect. J'étais sensible au fait que quelques-uns n'étaient pas très confortables, n'étaient pas à l'aise. Donc, j'ai commencé à parler un tout petit peu en français. Et puis, the whole tapestry of the meeting changed. I mean, it was a Genome Canada application we were working on. Genome Quebec was involved, and it was clear there were tensions in the team that you could pick up. And when we switched from English to French for discussion, I mean, the openness that became much clearer. People were much more open with me than they had been just speaking in English. So that's one of the, I think, aspects of collaboration where having that capacity is helpful. The second thing is at a level of just getting to know people, getting to start something. Just having a few words of the other language can make a huge difference in change of attitude. We had an experience about a month ago, Faculty Council. There were 2 representatives from Jiaotong University there, and they were fairly impassive throughout the meeting, and then the Dean introduced them at the end. And one of the professors in the faculty actually has been learning a little bit of Mandarin because he's got very active collaborations in southern China. So he just said a few words in Mandarin and the faces just lit up. They relaxed, they started to talk. In English, their English is perfectly good, but it just made that transition to putting them at ease. So I think for those 2 reasons, I mean, just brokering links and making a scale of breaking down some barriers to get together a group, it's enormously helpful. And I think that's an aspect for making the effort just to say a few words. I have been to Japan once, and I tried to learn a few words. I was beaten on that one. I couldn't cope with that. But in other aspects, I mean, I find it very helpful. And then the other experience of just finding that, having a bit deeper understanding. And I mean, I find myself that if I'm in a situation where I'm using the other language for maybe 2 to 3 days, as distinct from 2 to 3 minutes, I become much more fluent, much more at ease. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, I can be interacting quite actively. The other point I would say is I've not just worked with people in Quebec, but I've also recently started working with the CNFS, which is an organization that's dealing with minority francophone health outside of Quebec, which is, I'm still trying to get used to these concepts in Canada about why the assumption that French in every province would would be homogeneous in some way, but it's there. So there were many people from New Brunswick, which I think is the only officially bilingual province. Mm-hmm. I got that Trivial Pursuit question. Some from Nouvelle-Écosse, some from Manitoba, some Boniface, and from Alberta Saint-Jean. And I mean, having those people, I mean, first of all, the French was much more understandable than the people from Ottawa.
Wow.
But secondly, I mean, again, that was a meeting that I couldn't have had if I didn't have some capacity in French.
Okay.
So it definitely did open doors. And the collaboration was actually, I mean, the first day, it was like my efforts to speak French here, it's like putting a manual stick shift car through gravel when you don't get the clutch working properly. But the second day, things had got more relaxed, but people were very open and they were extremely willing to collaborate. So, I think it just helps about establishing that sense of trust. Being able to go there.
One last point.
Last little
Two other people. Yep.
point
Where you go.
on working on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I still work with people in Lyon. I still work with people in Paris whom I met when I was in Lyon, and that's after 20 years.
Excellent. OK. Professeur Lévesque, moi, j'avais 2 questions pour vous. Puis je vais vous donner peut-être 4 minutes. Puis parce que Huguette a quand même besoin de 5 minutes, puis on a 8 minutes. Alors, je sais qu'il y a une nouvelle mathématique qui existe en quelque part, mais je ne sais pas si elle va régler notre problème pour l'instant. Alors, mais je crois que vous avez aussi parlé un peu de la deuxième question. La deuxième était, avez-vous l'occasion de mettre en pratique vos compétences en anglais dans votre milieu de travail, étant donné le milieu? Mais l'autre question que j'avais, que je vous ai donnée, c'était, avons-nous en réalité un campus bilingue? Alors, je vous envoie cette patate chaude.
C'est une véritable question
Oui.
de...
Dans 3 minutes.
C'est une véritable question de conclusion. Donc, est-ce qu'on a un campus bilingue? Évidemment, tout le monde le sait. Ici, nos services universitaires sont généralement bilingues et puis, à ma connaissance, ils sont de bonne qualité. Je ne peux pas parler pour l'ensemble du campus ni de l'ensemble des facultés. Ce qui se passe dans mon département et dans la faculté des sciences sociales, à mon avis, on est effectivement dans un campus qui est, évidemment, ce n'est pas une situation parfaite sur le plan du bilinguisme, mais à mon avis, on est dans une situation quand même relativement positive. J'ai mentionné que dans mon département, la langue publique, c'est le français, mais fondamentalement, on travaille dans un contexte bilingue. Nous rencontrons des étudiants qui sont des anglophones, des francophones. Chaque personne supervise des étudiants francophones, anglophones. Moi, je supervise des étudiants anglophones. Donc, il y a des anglophones qui supervisent des étudiants francophones. Donc, on a, sur le plan de notre travail de professeur, si on veut, on a vraiment un milieu dans lequel on a recours aux 2 langues de façon systématique. C'est vrai aussi au niveau de la recherche. Là où j'ai le plus utilisé mes compétences en anglais, c'est dans des équipes de travail avec d'autres collègues qui venaient soit de mon département, soit de d'autres départements. Et à ce moment-là, on travaillait généralement sous un format bilingue. Toutes les personnes s'exprimaient dans les 2 langues. Évidemment, lorsqu'une personne était plus familière avec une langue ou l'autre, il utilisait davantage cette langue, mais c'était un contexte relativement bilingue et relativement équilibré. Une autre caractéristique, à mon avis, d'un milieu bilingue, c'est celui de la tolérance. C'est-à-dire qu'ici, à Ottawa, on peut faire des fautes en anglais, faire des fautes en français. Et puis, personne ne va rire de nous. On se sent à l'aise d'avoir des problèmes, de faire parfois des tournures de phrases qui font peu de sens dans la deuxième langue. Mais c'est un domaine, un milieu dans lequel on nous reçoit et on accepte ces difficultés. Et ça, à mon avis, c'est une caractéristique fondamentale pour un milieu. C'est-à-dire que si on veut développer le bilinguisme à une large échelle, il faut que ce milieu-là soit accueillant au processus d'apprentissage. Sinon, ça devient extrêmement difficile. Et à mon avis, ici, l'Université d'Ottawa est un milieu très, très positif pour l'accueil de ce point de vue-là.
OK. Bravo. Merci. Alors, je vais céder la parole à la toute fin maintenant à Huguette, encore, qui va nous parler de projets futurs pour le service de formation. You get?
Oui, je pense que la première chose que je voudrais dire, c'est que je pense que la table ronde est un véritable succès parce qu'on voulait montrer tous les défis. On les a montrés, je pense. C'est pas parfait, c'est pas un campus bilingue parfait, mais c'est comme Monsieur l'évêque vient de le dire. Une belle expérience de tolérance, de s'accepter. Et comme je fais affaire à des profs et que je pourrais employer le mot tolérance, là, on aurait la question, mais non, pas tolérance, parce que si on prend tolérance, ça veut dire qu'on tolère les autres. Mais non, on est égal. Mais, alors voilà. Et la discussion continue et continue, mais c'est absolument magnifique de travailler avec un corps professoral. Ce sont des gens absolument super. Et j'aimerais bien pouvoir en faire un peu plus pour eux. Je trouve souvent que les cours de maintien seraient absolument, absolument essentiels, surtout pour les gens qui ont un niveau de bilinguisme passif. Mais souvent, il n'y a pas les fonds, ou bien on n'est pas tout à fait organisé, ou bien les profs n'ont pas le temps, ils ont des horaires chargés, etc. Il y a beaucoup, beaucoup de choses à faire, mais comme je dis, je pense que pour le moment, moi, ce que j'aimerais faire, ce serait vraiment pousser la recherche et ensuite offrir la possibilité pour les profs francophones de publier en anglais. Alors voilà, je suis très contente. Je ne sais pas si vous avez des questions pour les profs ou pour...
2-3 minutes pour des questions. Pas de questions. Il a? Oui. Il a un microphone. Ça s'en vient.
Yes, a question for Professor Jaya. I imagine that given the context where you're working now, a passive level of bilingualism is obviously a minimum. I imagine that there must be incentives or at least a will on your part, time being a factor, of course, but a will to probably, because of that situation, to increase your level of bilingualism, to be in a position where, in fact, passive becomes passé, if you want, and you're moving towards a higher degree of competency and efficiency, I gather, especially in a context where, as many of you, I suppose, would eventually or will eventually be asked to act as either head of department or maybe deans, where I imagine in this university it would probably be compulsory to have a higher level. Am I correct to assume that?
Actually, you've touched upon something which I didn't have time to talk about, and I was going to say that given the reality of at least my department, as well as, of course, if you want to go up in the ranks in terms of administration, the truth is that even though you've been hired with your contract saying that the expectation is passive bilingualism, to really move up. Let's move up in a way. What I mean is, for example, if you want to aspire to be even a chair of a committee, for instance, at least in our department, or the chair of the department, or the dean or vice dean, whatever, it would be necessary to be actually actively bilingual, really. That's the reality. You can't really function without that, I would think. It would be very overwhelming if you had to function with a lower level. So that being said, yes, there is an incentive from the individual's side, like someone like me, to try to aspire to that. Do we want to do that, or do you want to do that? I think that's really something that each person negotiates for himself or herself. Sometimes it's frustrating because, okay, I want to actively engage with the life of the department, so I'm doing that through my participation in committees, but maybe I can never become chair of graduate studies or chair of undergraduate studies because I may feel that, what if I can't keep up? What if I can't keep up with the level of expectation in the second language in terms of correspondence, interactions, everything? So I think the question is more to be answered at the individual level. So for me, I would say, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to go forth and keep moving up and say, okay, I want to be the chair, I want to be this, I want to be that? Or do you say, well, that's not really something that I'm interested in, and go the other route and say, I will focus on my teaching and research and just try to excel in that? So I think that it really depends on the individual, and It's a very good question. And obviously, that's something that you really have to think about. Like, in the beginning, you don't really realize that, at least I didn't. But now I figure out, okay, well, if I really want to do some of the things that I may want to do, I would have to improve my level of French to that expectation and maybe actually become actively bilingual. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But is it really, I don't know. It's a lot of investment of time, effort, taking away from other things that you may want to do and adding on to some of the things that you're already doing. So I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a very personal, individual negotiation process that goes on. So.
But we end on a positive note. There's opportunity and investment. So can we have a round of applause, please, for our panel?